Fearless men who jump and die, men who mean just what they say, the brave men of the Green Beret, silver wings.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this, the Ted Maravillas America First Hour. Tonight's episode will be dealing with the Second Amendment to the Constitution, and as usual, I think that would be a good idea for you to tape this show on your VCR. There's a lot of good information that's going to be coming up. In the guest portion of our show, which is later on, we're going to have Mr. Mike Yacino from Gun Owners Action League, talk about the Second Amendment related issues such as crime, gun ownership, what have you. We'll also have Peter Caroline joining him as well. He happens to be the 001. And just say, I'd like to have my yard sprayed. And I highly encourage you to do that. I think if we all got together and requested that, we shouldn't have to request it. It should be automatic. But maybe we can, decrease those bugs that they're responsible for, besides malaria and the spreads of other controversial diseases, they also spread encephalitis, which, causes inflammation of the brain. And we had a fatality here in Devers, and, mosquitoes are a very serious thing, and we're not doing anything serious to combat it. This is just a little thing, and I think, hopefully, you'll take advantage of that, because, we're more concerned about plants than we are about humans. But anyways, that's that. Also, let me just tell you, just to give you a perspective of their current media bias. Here in the Boston Globe, it talks about Judge Breyer being nominated to the Supreme Court, and it has political descriptions of the current justices on the Supreme Court. It has Sandra Day O'Connor, Anthony Kennedy, and David Souter as moderates. Well, David Souter happens to be, the #1 pro-gay rights justice, according to the a homosexual newspaper in Washington, D.C., by their own admission. And he happens to be a radical pro-abortion rights supporter, as are Kennedy, and especially Sandra Day O'Connor. These people are not moderates, they are liberals. Judge Breyer is an extreme liberal. Not as liberal as John Paul Stevens or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but nevertheless liberal, and certainly he will not vote to protect life. And in my opinion, if a justice will not recognize the right to life in this country, he has automatically disqualified himself not only from the Supreme Court, but any type of judicial position whatsoever. And as such, if you are a pro-life senator, you have no business voting for confirming Judge Breyer. And that just gives you a perspective that he ain't moderate. He's a liberal. And the media wants you to think that he's a moderate. Well, he's not. He's really not. And, of course, people like, Clarence Thomas, he's like a right-winger. They always say right-winger. It's never conservative or traditionalist or supporter of the United States Constitution. Original intent of the Founding Fathers. No, it's, right-wing. But just keep that in mind. They always make the conservatives look like they're extreme, and the liberals, wow, they're moderate and more refined, you see. But it's a falsehood, and it's basically a smokescreen. Okay, Second Amendment. Here's what the Second Amendment says for those who have not been taught in public schools, and that's probably most of us. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed, and shall not be infringed. Well, increasingly, the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, has been increasingly under attack. Indeed, in the state of Massachusetts, the lawless Supreme Judicial Court has stated that there is no right to no right to own a gun, and also a police chief throughout the community can deny a resident a right to pursue their Second Amendment rights if he or she believes that they are not of suitable character. In other words, if they brush their hair the wrong way, a police chief can say, you're not a suitable character, and deny you your Second Amendment rights. Imagine if we tried to deny the First Amendment rights of Nelson Benton in the Salem Evening News because we didn't think he was of suitable character. Oh, then there would be protests. Well, the Second Amendment makes possible the protection of all of our other rights guaranteed to us in the Bill of Rights. And just to give you some historical perspective, lest you fall into the trap of the revisionists who happen to control the media to a large degree, let me give you some of the quotes of our founding fathers. I mean, they're the ones that really should know about the Second Amendment. They wrote it, and you know, if we're not going to be, if we have, as Rush says, if we have, Rush Limbaugh, if we have the courage to face the truth on this program and elsewhere, then we must take a look at what the original intent of the founding fathers were, with original quotes, not from what liberal revisionists say in 1994, but back then. What did they say? You may disagree with it, but what did they say? Richard Henry Lee, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, quote, "A militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves, and include all men capable of bearing arms. To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of people always possess arms." You know, the liberal argument that, oh, it's just for a state militia. Richard Henry Lee said, no, it's the people themselves, and that's a well-known fact. And yet you have revisionists, even up in the Supreme Court, who deny that. Samuel Adams, besides being a brewer, was also a patriot, and he wrote this: "The Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States, who are peaceable citizens, from keeping their own arms. Those who deny that, like Sarah Brady, are liars." That is to say, the Founding Fathers intended for us to have the right to keep and bear arms, the choice to do that. Freedom of choice. George Mason, a man who was critical in giving us our Bill of Rights, he was the Constitution, which limited federal government big time, was even too big for George Mason. In other words, he didn't even trust the pea-sized federal government that was given to us by our Founding Fathers. And so we had the Second Amendment, we had the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. George Mason, who has a great school named after him in Virginia, by the way. "I ask, sir, what is the militia? It is the whole people. To disarm the people is the best and most effectual way to enslave them. To disarm the people is the best and most effectual way to enslave them." In a relatively recent New American special edition on the Waco assassination by the federal government shock troops of the BATF, we see here a BATF agent in his badge. Funny thing about his badge is his badge number is covered by a piece of tape. Now, you can probably obtain this at the Danvers Library. If not, write to me. But why is he covering his badge with a piece of tape? Because he knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew that killing 90 men, women, and children for no reason, without properly serving a search warrant, which was not based on anything at all, was totally unconstitutional deprivation of their rights. By the way they served the warrant was to shoot Koresh's bedroom. Usually knock on the door and say, "Here's the warrant." It was, incidentally, 17 children under the age of 8, I believe, were massacred by the federal government. And my question to Bill Clinton would be: did you feel their pain? Attorney General Janet Reno, did you feel their pain? I think not. And I think we have to take a look at what the Second Amendment is, because if we don't, I think we're going to have more of Waco and more goons like this man over here who sold his liberty and who has lost his citizenship status as far as I'm concerned. Thomas Paine, a founding father: "Arms discourage and keep the invader and plunderer in awe, and preserve the world as property. Horrid mischief would ensue were the law-abiding deprived of the use of them. When you disarm the populace, increased killings will result, okay, both by the government and by hoodlums." Thomas Jefferson, a well-known founding father: "Laws that forbid the carrying of arms disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes. Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides, for an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man." That's just common sense. In fact, Thomas Paine actually wrote a book called Common Sense, but we don't have too much of that in the liberal media, in the government these days. Benjamin Franklin: "They that give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." That's true. Thomas Jefferson: "No free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms. Oh, the Second Amendment was given to us so we can go hunting. No, that's Marxist revisionist thought control propaganda. It's just not true. You may disagree with the Second Amendment of the Constitution, but be sure that the Second Amendment gives you an inviolate right to keep and bear arms. And when we have them going through the Brady Bill and the ban on guns, that is a travesty of justice. John Adams, arms in the hands of individual citizens may be used at individual discretion in private self-defense. James Madison, the father of the Constitution preserves the advantage of being armed which Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation where the governments are afraid to trust the people with arms. What are they afraid of? Or the question is, what do they want to do? Do they not want to create a police state? My question is yes. My answer is yes. And I think we'll see that more and more unless we limit the politicians' ability to curtail our rights on a whim. I hope you'll stay with us for the remainder of the program where we'll talk more in depth about the Second Amendment. And until then, we'll talk to you later.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jim Burrows with tonight's commentary. Today is July 21st, 1994, and this is an election year. There will be a primary in September, and the general election will be held in November. I will dedicate this and future commentaries until the election to a series of commentaries I will entitle Informed Voter Updates. Tonight I will focus on constituent representation. When you cast your ballot for the candidate of your choice on Election Day, what criteria will you use? If you asked an elected politician how he or she represents their constituents, what response do you think you would get? How can an elected official represent constituencies of such various opinions and backgrounds? All federal and state elected politicians must take an oath of office. I'll read that oath right now. I, your name, do solemnly swear that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and will support the Constitution thereof, so help me God. I, your name, do solemnly swear and affirm that I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon me as the position, according to the best of my abilities and understanding, agreeably to the rules and regulations of the Constitution and the laws of this Commonwealth, so help me God. I, your name, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States. Okay, now if the oath of office specifically demands that elected officials support the Constitution, and the Second Amendment of the Constitution reads, Second Amendment of the United States Constitution reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Then, how can someone support gun control and still uphold his oath of office? If we are willing to give up our rights for some perceived security, then we deserve neither. The basic principle I would like to focus on is the principle, not the issue. There are millions of issues, but the principle is what I want to focus on. The principle of how constituents are represented. There are pro-gun constituents, there are anti-gun constituents. So who will be represented? Who will be supported? The choices are, I see three: the gun owners, the anti-gun owners, or the Constitution. If we elect politicians on issues, and then he with the most votes wins, and the issue is in violation of the Constitution, then we will systematically, one by one, lose all of our rights. History has shown time and time again that once a government usurps its people's rights, the people will be helpless victims and the government a tyrant. Are we to be ruled by laws and principles or by the numerous emotional issues of the day? In summary, I'd like to quote Proverbs chapter 29, verse 2. It is the glory of God to conceal things. It is the glory of kings to search them out. Who will you elect? For whom will you cast your vote? For someone who has all the answers, or for one who will search them out? One who will support our Constitution, or one who lives by popular opinions? The choice is yours. God bless you, and good night.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our show. To my right, we have Michael Yacino of Gun Owners Action League. Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
And over here, we have Peter Caroline, president of the Hamilton Wenham Rod and Gun Club. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we're about ready to continue our discussion on the Second Amendment, a vital part of our Constitution, which some say is coming under attack these days by all branches of government. Well, Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about Gun Owners Action League and what you are trying to do to stem the tide on the assault on the Second Amendment?
Briefly, GOAL was formed back in 1974, specifically to monitor legislation which at that time began to be filed directed more against the legitimate gun owner than the criminal element. And it was touted as crime control, but obviously it wasn't intended to reduce crime. Since that point in time, we've spent most of our energies trying to educate both the public and the legislators, not so much just on what we would like to see them do, but what exists. Most people in the Commonwealth don't realize, for instance, that if they carry mace or bodyguard or some chemical substance, that they need a firearms license. And if they don't have that license, they're subject to 1 to 5 years in state prison. It's those kinds of things, I think, that the general public, your viewers, need to know in order to make a determination as to whether or not the new proposals really make any sense. Will they, in fact, help to reduce crime? I might add that we have offered our legislature an opportunity through our 12-point crime control package to do something really positive to impact crime. An end to plea bargaining, I think, is one of the more important ones. Many of the DAs that we've talked to will argue that they've gotten good convictions, but they plea bargained away from real sentencing. In fact, the so-called Bartley-Fox, this famous law that everybody said was going to reduce crime so much, is used as a tool to get out of going to jail by the career criminal. If he's charged with armed robbery or assault with intent and he has a firearm without a license, he pleads guilty to the gun charge, takes the 1 year in jail, and avoids going for 15 or 20. I mean, that's not crime control. It's an insult to the public to see that happening. We need qualified judges. We need better trained prosecutors. We need to give some teeth to law enforcement. The police officer today has no support from anybody. He makes a good arrest, he gets that person into the court, and all of a sudden he's out on the street before the cop finishes his reports. I mean, there's no logic to the system. We need bail reform. I'm glad to see that Governor Wells been pushing that. The truth in sentencing, which we've argued for a long period of time, that he signed, the governor signed earlier this year, doesn't really get at the heart of the problem like we had hoped it would, but it is a step in the right direction. I think the boot camp idea is a good idea. There's a lot of things that we would like to see the state do. The last thing I'll mention is that we have been filing, just so your viewers can understand that we don't just argue against what we see as bad gun laws. We've filed a simple bill, what we think is a simple bill. It would require that any person who uses a firearm during and in relation to the commission of a crime be punished by 5-year mandatory penalty. No furloughs, no paroles, no suspension, no concurrent sentencing, 5 years in prison, period. We can't get the bill out of committee. Now, we've been filing that thing for 15 years.
One wonders if legislation concerning the Second Amendment is not really related to stopping crime, but rather it is to try to disarm those who wish to pursue their Second Amendment rights.
Yes, and quite honestly, a lot of the arguments by the Clinton administration that we're protecting the rights of sportsmen and hunters. The Second Amendment has nothing to do with hunting. It has nothing to do with target shooting. It has to do with people's right to defend their life, and not just from a criminal element, a highwayman element, but from a bad government, if it comes to that. I mean, we like to think that our right to vote gives us the opportunity to change the people in government who have been impotent at dealing in crime and who have focused their attention on punishing you and I rather than the true criminal. But if that fails, then what is our option?
Well, actually, I think we see what happens when that does fail in pre-World War II Germany, in Stalinist Russia, and in China. We see there what has happened when a totalitarian government has gained control of a populace and has disarmed the people. And what has happened? We've had holocausts, we've had mass murders, because when you have a police state, that is, I think, much more conducive to mass killings than say, for instance, a republic that, like this country that's undergoing a crime wave. As serious as that is, to disarm the populace the way the totalitarian leaders have done before, it seems to me creates even a larger potential for disaster. And when I hear, like, President Clinton talks about, well, the rights of sportsmen, he supposedly is a hunter or whatever. I read in the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It doesn't really say anything about hunting in there, does it?
Not at all.
Although those who do wish to pursue their Second Amendment rights have venues to train, to practice, and that's why we have a lot of fish and game clubs and rod and gun clubs around this area. And in fact, Peter, I know you had one up in Hamilton, Wenham.
That's correct.
And sometimes we hear about the negative aspects of gun ownership. Yet I think that you could probably give us some explanations as to the benefits of owning a gun and coming to clubs like yours to practice and get their skills down, in addition to like recreational purposes. What do you have to say about that?
Well, actually, most of our members do own guns for recreational purposes, whether it's target shooting or hunting. We have one member who lives in Essex, who is a nationally recognized pistol competitor, and he just came back from Camp Perry, and he was one of the top 20, I believe, in the country overall at the recent Camp Perry competitions. So this is as much an athletic contest as pole vaulting or running or whatever. We also have an educational segment in the club. We run a home firearms safety program. We have once or twice a month a classroom session in the morning and then a range session in the afternoon. And as a matter of fact, this is required by local police departments on the North Shore in order to get your initial pistol permit or to renew it after 5 years. So we have been working with the police departments on that to certify or recertify people.
Actually, I have a question for both of you. Say, for instance, someone does get their license to carry, and I guess it expires in 5 years here in Massachusetts. Do they again have to take that course? Is it required, or is it depending on your local police
chief? It depends on the local chief. On the North Shore, most of the local chiefs have agreed that they will require some sort of a course. And I've had people, club members in their 70s, call me up and say, "What is this? I've had a permit to carry since I was 21 years old, and they want me to take this course." And I said, "Take it. It's a good course."
Oh boy!
But I think that addresses a whole new problem, though, Ted. And that problem being that it appears the government has taken it upon themselves to determine that this is a privilege.
Absolutely.
Determine that because it's a privilege, they have the right to regulate. In fact, they have the right to over-regulate, as they do anything else. Just think, if you would, I wonder how the media would like it if they had to pass some kind of a test, and that test could be arbitrarily administered by an appointed public official, not even elected, not even subject to the people's review. That's what we go through as gun owners. I absolutely oppose any mandatory testing of people to own a firearm. They have a right to own a gun. It's not a privilege. It specifically is a right. And I think that although it's a responsibility of the individual to learn the safe use and handling of firearms, we don't need the government to mandate something like that and take away the person's right. Quite clearly in the case of self-defense. I mean, do you think we should have maybe had a check station at the Concord Bridge in 1775 to make sure those farmer, citizen, soldiers knew what they were doing, you know?
Well, you know, we have a local newspaper here in the area, the Salem Evening News, and not that I like to bash on papers, but it's headed up by an editor who is extremely anti-Second Amendment. But can you imagine myself or a government entity saying to that paper, look, every 5 years you're going to have to undergo a test to see, you know, if you are proficient enough for us to give you your First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and the freedom of press. Can you imagine a legislation like that being proposed? Can you just even imagine it? And yet, in principle, that is the same thing what they're doing with you know, mandatory testing. The fact that, I guess the current law right now in Massachusetts is a police chief can deny you your right to engage in your Second Amendment privilege. It's a right, just because he thinks that you might not be of, is it suitable character, I think is the
That's
words,
correct.
are the words. Isn't that, so it's basically, out of a whim, an unelected person can deny you the Second Amendment to the Constitution.
It clearly is an arbitrary discretion. I can remember back a number of years ago debating Chief Burroughs, and he made the statement that he had the power to take away people's liberties. He had the authority and the discretion. I quoted him. This was a meeting that was sponsored by the League of Women Voters.
What's the chief's name?
And Burroughs.
You mean the one here in Danvers?
That's correct.
Oh, boy.
And he was questioned by a number of people in the audience that where did he get that awesome authority all of a sudden, that he could just arbitrarily decide that a person couldn't exercise their rights? I agree with you with the media. I think the media has sort of slapped itself in the face over the last few years. One of the arguments about the regulation is, well, yes, you have a right to free speech, but you don't have a right to yell fire in a theater. Well, you can. Unless you can't speak, you can do that. But if you've caused harm to someone, you'll be punished for it. That's our argument on the issue of firearms ownership. Don't interfere with the legal right of someone. If they break the law, if they hurt a person, as our proposal of 5-year penalty suggests, then punish them. But don't punish the mass millions for doing nothing wrong. There are 2 million people in Massachusetts who have licenses to own firearms. If they were breaking the law, there'd be nobody around to argue. So clearly there's a long history of people not abusing their rights. And I think that it's absolutely abhorrent that they would focus their attention on these individuals.
It is amazing. I'm sure you folks know about the Kennesaw, Georgia situation.
Oh, yes.
It's a town in Georgia which has passed mandatory gun possession and ownership, and it's basically reduced crime to like statistically 0.
That's correct.
You know, this is some of the statistics that are not cited by, you know, local news media sources here in the North Shore, and I think it's unfortunate. But can you give us an update as to what is going on first at the state level in terms of gun control legislation? We were talking earlier about Governor Weld proposing some gun control legislation. What did he propose, and what is the status of that right now?
Initially, what he came forward with in September of last year, September 29th to be exact, as I stood 5 or 6 feet away from him, he suggested that we ban certain firearms. He had a list of 7 specific firearms. He suggested that we limit a person's ability to purchase guns legally to 1 a month. He suggested that although we have in this state what effectively is a 40-day waiting period because you have to wait to get the license, so you can't get the gun until you have the license, he suggested in addition to that, that you also have to wait to take legal possession of this item that you legally purchase. All of those things tended to take away from his original crime proposals. I mean, the punishment of criminals, enhanced penalties, the boot camps, all that type of stuff. And I urged the governor not to do what he was about to do, to stick to his guns, if you will, and stay focused on the real priorities of reducing crime, but he chose not to do that. The bill did take a public hearing. There was a tremendous amount of opposition. We tried to reason with him and respond to what he said his attorneys and BATF agents, the agents who murdered the 90 people down in Texas, he said he was responding to their request for more police support. We answered all his questions. In January, as you're probably aware, he ignored everything that we responded to him, and he came forward again this year with basically his same proposal. It has pretty much been defeated, except for the portion that he insisted we put in about increasing the penalties for illegally trafficking in guns, something Gall supported. That portion did come out of the bill. Unfortunately, it was attached to a change in the 209A restraining order sections of law, which are causing a lot of havoc, not only to police, but gun owners. On the positive side of things, some of the legislation which we have filed to really punish criminals is still alive. That doesn't mean it's going anywhere. Certainly to most politicians that means, well, it's going to sit there until the end of the year and die rather than dying now.
Right.
But I think in an election year, I've urged a lot of the people that I've talked to, and I've interviewed a lot of candidates, if you get elected, or if you as an individual are talking to someone running for office, question them about this issue and make sure they're specific. Don't let them say, well, I support a waiting period.
Right.
What's that mean?
Right.
Get to the point, get to the heart of what you're trying to do. Are you after the criminal, or are you trying to contain the person who does nothing wrong?
Right.
I mean, obviously it's easier to chase someone who doesn't chase you back.
Let's jump to the federal level. What's going on? What type of legislation is the federal government proposing? You know, the Clinton administration in Congress, and give us a status of that.
Capsulized, the crime bill is really the focus of most attention. The so-called Brady bill that was signed into law last year has done absolutely nothing to reduce crime, but it has clearly encumbered a lot of honest citizens. We get feedback that in some of the states that didn't have such a waiting period, that because of the archaic record-keeping systems, that a lot of people have been arbitrarily denied and then later found out that there was no problem. There are also 3 states that have sued the federal government and won in court, Arizona being the classic example, because it was a mandate on the states to do something by the federal government that there was no funding for. And that the sheriff's departments and the police departments are arguing that we're understaffed as it is, and you're now mandating that we do something that we don't have the resources to do, and you're not going to provide the resources.
That's a favorite one, unfunded federal mandates. They're trying to do the same thing with some environmental project in the Salem Harbor. They're forcing taxpayers to, pay like 3 times as much in their sewer bills just because of a court order from a federal judge. And, here's the federal government, a guy who's unelected said, you pay 300% of what you're paying now, or 3 times as much, and this is done totally, without funding from the federal government. And
well,
so
the bulk of the crime bill is just that. There are some mandates in the crime bill to communities. Effectively, what he's doing is he's taking money from the states and then regurgitating it with a bunch of strings attached to it. The other thing in the crime package that's attached to it is this so-called assault rifle ban again. It's unfortunate that the media has chosen not to actually publicize the bill, because our arguments have been against the language and the specificity of what's written in the bill. Originally, they talked about only banning 8 guns. Then that 8 went to 19. When ATF testified at the public hearing, they said, oh no, it's over 200. You begin to say, well, who's telling the truth? Is anybody in government telling the truth? And when some of our congressmen voted in favor of the ban and were later questioned, they said, well, we hadn't had a chance to read the entire bill, but the concept sounded like a good idea. The concept of what? Taking away my ability to defend myself with a firearm that I've chosen to purchase legally? What sense does that make? Are you after the criminal? Clinton said that these firearms were the choice of drug dealers. Boy, that sounds great in public. How about asking the ATF and the FBI if that washes statistically? Well, when it was asked by Senator McClure, the ATF came forward and said, well, no, that's not true. In fact, we've only got a couple of cases now.
Less than 1% are related to semi-automatic weapons, and that's in actually the common perception of how they define semi-automatic weapons. You know, things like street sweepers and stuff like that. And people just don't go around using those things.
No.
You know, and the common perception is like every other crime is with like a a motorized cannon. But actually, the current specifications on that assault weapons ban, am I not right? Would not that ban an ownership of a 9mm? You know, a 15
There
round?
are some handguns that would be included. There are a number of rifles that would be included. There are some shotguns that would be included. Again, you need to look at the definition. You're absolutely right. You're on it in the right track. If your viewers should know that one of the candidates who's running against Peter Torkelson filed an amendment to the state budget in which he defined the term semi-automatic. The way he defined it to a shooter will understand this perhaps better than the average person, but he defined it as any firearm which with a single depression of the trigger will continue to fire the magazine with each depression of the trigger. Well, if you think about that in the real terms, that's a double-barrel shotgun because you have more than one round. Anything more than a single shotgun would have been banned by the proposal that was put before our state legislature. Now, luckily, he was unsuccessful in doing this, but it's ironic that they want to change everything that we've had so many years of. I mean, we know that semi-automatic firearms are used all the time in international competition. The AR-15, which seems to be one of these evil guns that they keep talking about, is the very firearm which we use to train the juniors because of its low energy, because of its lightweight, its low caliber. It's used to train young people in the safe use and handling of firearms and is one of the firearms used in international competition.
Just for the sake of my viewers, and not that I'm a ballistics expert, but an AR-15, which is a civilian version of the M16, you know, what they used in Vietnam or whatever what they use now, in actuality, that AR-15 is, the bullet itself is actually smaller than a regular Colt 45, the way that, you know, the Western, the cowboys used to use, the bullet size itself. And the action is the same.
The semi-automatic action is the same as innumerable kinds of firearms that are used in hunting and competition.
Only difference being the looks, right?
Right. It's a cosmetically challenged gun. It doesn't have beautiful walnut and, you know, spotless shining blue. From a ballistic standpoint, the 223 or 5.56 millimeter cartridge is what's usually called in hunting a varmint cartridge. It's of a category of cartridges. It's used for hunting very small game like prairie dogs and woodchucks and things like that. This is not the explosive man killer that it's touted to be.
In fact, actually, it's the military version itself. I think was, you know, supposedly intended more to wound as opposed to the AK-47, which is more of a stopping power.
That's it. In battle, the idea is more to wound than to kill because a dead enemy just lays there. A wounded enemy has to be taken out by at least one or two other people, and he'll be using up more attention and more manpower.
So basically, we are talking about playing on people's emotions and cosmetics, but what is really at issue is a fundamental right, which, if lost, could indeed lead to a police state. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, clearly, they've tried to pick something. The Clinton thinkers have tried to pick something that has evil in and of itself. You know, that's the message they're trying to get across. And I think any reasonable mind that would sit down and look at the facts could understand that that simply isn't the case, that cosmetics, as my colleague talks about it, just it's idiotic. It's absurd to do that. I mean, people might like the looks of a Cadillac instead of a Volkswagen, but they're still automobiles and they get you from point A to point B. So should we ban the Volkswagens? I mean, because they look bad? There's no logic.
Speaking of banning cars, I could be wrong, but I believe that cars cause more fatalities than any other cause in the U.S.?
Well, without causing some controversy between you and I here, I don't think the car does anything any more than the gun does.
Right.
Clearly, the human is the problem. I mean, if you
Right.
look at Mothers Against Drunk Driving, they didn't go against booze and they didn't go
Right.
against the automobile.
Right.
They went against the person. That's what we're trying to do.
Right.
We're trying to get the government to focus its attention on the person, the people, and punish the person. Don't hang the gun. Don't hang the knife. You've had, in the Laurel area, the machete killings, I mean, the baseball bat killings in Pennsylvania. We're not going to ban baseball bats, but we're going to try to get at the people who are doing the wrong. We need to separate those people from a peaceful society. One of my pet projects, Governor Weld has put me on the Neighborhood Crime Watch Commission, and I'm trying to work with law officers to effect a true partnership between the citizen soldier, perhaps, but the citizen in crime watch programs working with the law officer to reduce crime. Let's get at the criminal, take him out of our peaceful society. That's going to make us much better. That's going to make the community a safer place to live. Taking my gun away isn't going to do that because it's never been used to hurt anybody.
Well, I agree with that. And again, the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia. If people are armed, working in conjunction in a neighborhood watch program, crime will go down. It will go down. Now, yeah, we need the crime prevention and the crime punishment programs to be initiated. I think the 30 years of the liberal judicial system has caused the crime to go up, among other factors. But to deny the proper ownership of guns is really to destroy the essence of what this country was founded upon. I mean, we were founded upon individual self-reliance, and for 200 years it's served us very, very well. And I think it's very unfortunate that that we have like revisionist people saying, well, the Second Amendment really wasn't intended for private gun ownership. I'm going to be dealing with that in the future. But I guess what I'm saying is that we need entities like GOAL informing us of what's going on at the state and federal level. We need the NRA to let us know what's going on in Washington, because obviously the people in the media are very biased against the Second Amendment, and they're not going to give you the full story.
Ted, let me make it very clear. I do not advocate that everybody owns a gun. My advocacy is for their right to choose. And if anybody has an objection to that, then they must object to the entire structure of our nation, the entire construction of our Constitution, the reason for our Declaration of Independence. I advocate that people have the right to make their own decision. And I say that truthfully because I argued against the Kennesaw, Georgia law. You see, I don't believe that the government has a right to tell me that I have to have a gun, any more than they have the right to tell me I can't. That's my reasoning. I'm not two-faced. I don't flip-flop like Bill Weld does. When I make a statement, I mean it philosophically, right through. You have a right to make your own decision. You have a right under the First Amendment to believe in God or be an atheist. That's your choice. Now, the things that happened in Waco almost make you believe that you have to get government approval for what religion you believe in. I mean, see, there's no logic to that. And I track that to our issue, the gun issue. I try to bring the message to the public. If you have the facts, the public isn't stupid. Give them the facts. They'll make a good decision. They haven't been given the facts. They've been given one side of this. Don't ever give up your right to choose.
Thanks. Peter, I wanted to ask you a question as someone in the 6th Congressional District. Our Congressman, Peter Torkelson, a couple months ago, voted for the Brady bill.
That's
and
right.
I'm wondering, as president of a local rod and gun club, what are your reactions to that?
Well, initially we were incensed because we felt it was a betrayal. I've since talked to Mr. Torkelson, and of course, for very good political reasons, he voted for the Brady bill, and he said, and this may be true, this may not be true, that this was the only way that we could achieve eventually an instant check system. That the original bill with the instant check that called for an instant check, I don't recall the name of it, but that was going nowhere, that had no future, and that because Brady had this provision for 4 or 5 years hence, a mandatory instant check to be put in place, then this was the way to do it. Plus, the Brady bill was not going to affect Massachusetts because we were one of those states that was exempted from the 5-day waiting period. Now, you know, I can afford to be long on principle because I'm not running for re-election, or for election for that matter. But I can, you know, I can see his motivation as much as I dislike the idea of a Republican and somebody who was sworn to uphold our rights turning on us in that fashion, as I interpret it.
Okay. Although obviously, as much as I obviously despise that, he did vote the right way on the automatic or semi-automatic weapons ban, which was
Well,
nice.
that-
Unfortunately,
That
Peter
took a
Blue,
bit of doing.
it did. Oh, thanks to probably great people like, you know, gun owners like yourself. And,
Well, if you recall, some months ago in the Salem Evening News, there was a full-page ad that was put out by Handgun Control, Inc., and it talked about the, you know, the evil semi-automatic assault weapons and all that, and that everybody should call Peter Torkelson and tell him to vote for the semi-automatic ban.
okay, yeah.
Well, at this point, we started calling up and saying, don't, whatever you do, don't vote for this thing. And when we initially called up and said, you know, how is this going? Torkelson's staff said, well, so far 50 people have called in for the ban, and about 2 or 3 have called up against it. I said, okay, we'll fix that. We got on the phone and let a few of our people know about it. And we outnumbered them by, you know, by the time they stopped tabulating. But I think you cannot take these rights for granted. I mean, you've got to keep working, and you've got to keep assaulting these things.
Yeah, because unfortunately, we can't necessarily count on congressmen to just vote completely on principle, and I think that's what we kind of saw out there in Western Mass with Peter Blue voting not only for the Brady bill, but also for the gun ban. And, you know, Mike, what do you think about that?
Well, we met with him. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I called Peter to my office. We certainly had a good relationship when he served in the House. I asked him to come and speak to, I brought a bunch of businessmen, people from his constituency, to have him explain exactly what he did. And he gave us the pat rhetoric of, you know, the BATF suggested to me that we needed this to help reduce crime. He even said that 90% of his constituents supported it. Well, Ted, in a world of reality, 90% of anybody agree on nothing.
Okay.
So we did some polling for him and got him a tremendous amount of response that showed that that simply wasn't the case. In fact, he's gotten a number of letters from a lot of the business community that supported him and saying, we're not going to support you anymore. I mean, you've taken stands on other issues, but I mean, this was so easy to decide, given your constituency, that we can't understand why you did it. He's reversed his vote, like Weld, on a lot of things since he got elected to Congress. I don't know if it's the water down there, maybe. There's got to be something when all of a sudden you get in office, but I think that we need to get people more involved in the election process. One of Goal's primary functions is voter registration. We need more people to participate so that the congressmen, that legislators, that governors respond to the wishes of the people, not select a group that says, well, this is what we think you should be doing, not this advisor circle that a lot of these people focus around themselves with. Pollsters, depending on how you ask the question, you'll get an answer.
Right,
Those types of things, I think, legislator needs to communicate more with the general public. We urge them all to put out newsletters, just to get some feedback from people. Peter's calling of his members and talking to gun owners in the area. Clearly, that's an example of more participation. Whether you agree or disagree on the issue isn't the case in point. When you look at the voter turnout going lower and lower, that means the government's doing its thing on its own, and it's not responding to the general public. Public needs to participate. The my vote don't count just doesn't wash anymore. Get out there and participate in the process. All of you need to be part of the process. If we could get more participation, just look at the numbers. 2 million gun owners, 2.8 million voters. Clearly, if they all participate in the process, we'd straighten this whole mess out now.
Yeah, well, what we'll try to do, hopefully, is put up your address of Goal, just in case someone wants to write and get more information about your activities and your efforts to defend the Second Amendment. You know, we only have a few minutes left, but if we can, I'd like to let's talk about what happened in Waco, if we can. Of course, I've been on this show saying that I think that that the BATF and the federal government, their actions down in Waco is perhaps the most evil thing that the federal government has ever done overtly to the American populace. But that's just my opinion. What's your take on that?
Well, I think clearly it was a travesty. These people were murdered. And I believe that the government needs to be held accountable for that. If Janet Reno says she was in charge, then she needs to be arrested and tried for the travesty that took place in Waco, much like happened to the FBI agents in the Idaho situation with Randall Weed.
Right.
Even when it got to court, jury agreed. This was a travesty, yet nothing's happened. Ted, this isn't the first time. It happened to the Indians. It's happened to others in this country. The government needs to understand its role. Again, I urge people to get involved in the election process. You've got to make changes yourself, because what you have is a government sort of run amok. And it's not just on the gun issue. There are a lot of issues that people should be involved in a lot more heavily and voice their opinion. This welfare issue, this insurance issue. There are a lot of things that people need to start talking about because they're losing. We fought a revolution over 9% taxes and tariffs.
Right. 9%. What is it now?
42. I mean, clearly there's a reason there. You know, I really would like, if my message, the only message I can put out is get involved in the process. Become a player. Learn what the facts are, because otherwise you're just going to have your government run off by itself.
It's the nature of government. The Founding Fathers knew that the nature of government was to grow bigger and bigger and more tyrannical. That's why they tried everything in their power to limit it. And even there were some of those who said that the Constitution itself was a document that gave the federal government too much power. That is why it was necessary to give us a Bill of Rights to limit that power. The 10th Amendment and the Second Amendment give us the inherent right to make sure that we can protect our right to defend ourselves. And it's undeniable, absolutely undeniable. But unfortunately, like the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court is like, they're a law unto themselves, as are some of our legislators here in the Commonwealth. And they do not respect the Constitution. And a lot of people say, well, Constitution, who cares? Well, even though that they've never really studied the implications of gun control in other countries and other time periods, there are present complications in this country right now, and I think Waco is a direct result of that. Is there any intricacies or details of Waco that you think that our viewers might not necessarily have been given a straight deal on, and that you might want to bring up at this time?
Well, I don't know. I guess they watch this thing on television every night. They certainly could see what was going on there, the harassment of those people, the loud music, you know.
I heard they didn't tell about that. No one knew about the psychological operations, that they didn't tell people about that until later. I don't know if that was true or not.
Actually, that was on television.
Oh, okay.
They did show that.
But I heard the sounds of rabbits being murdered that they were doing.
It's a classic example of the same type of brainwashing, mind penetration that was used in the European countries years back.
But it's a clear violation of the First Amendment, because the First Amendment was not put in place to protect popular opinion or popular religion. It was put in place so that people would have the opportunity to participate in obnoxious speech or obnoxious behavior, as long as they weren't hurting anybody else.
Exactly.
And I guess that's the bottom line. These people have been not convicted of anything. There really wasn't any charges against anybody.
Well,
the Marshal Service, the Texas Rangers had refused to go in there. They wanted to get David Koresh. Well, he jogged every day. He went to the supermarket just like you and I. They could have picked him up anytime. What was the bottom line? They had budget hearings coming up. They wanted to justify their own doggone existence. So they wanted to prove to the Congress that they meant something. And they went in here thinking, boy, we can do this overnight and everything's going to be fine. With tanks and helicopters and gunships, give me a break, against American people, women and children.
Well,
what was going through their minds?
It's a violation. Most people don't know this, and it's weird. But there is a law. I think it's called the Posse Comitatus Act, that the United States Armed Forces cannot be used to kill American citizens on American soil. And I know it sounds kind of absurd, but that's exactly what happened. And the way they try to get around that is to say, well, they had a drug lab there. They just said that just to justify their, bringing U.S. tanks. Of course, that was never true. Just like, the charge of child abuse was disproven even beforehand. And of course, what's the most? I mean, how can you engage in more serious form of child abuse than to kill them by burning?
Yeah.
They used CS gas, the federal government, CS gas, a gas which has been banned by the Geneva Convention. I guess American troops were not allowed legally to use that gas against Iraqi soldiers. Now that fact alone, and it's extremely flammable, that fact alone has to be taken in consideration in terms of who was responsible for that fire and ultimately for the deaths of those people there.
My curiosity is, why did they bury it?
Yeah, why did they steamroll over it?
They violated
Yeah.
every rule of forensics
Yeah.
and good police investigation when they bulldozed the whole area.
And
it just didn't make any sense.
to me, it's overt, but I think that more and more people are going to come into the understanding that the Second Amendment was put there for a reason, that the Founding Fathers were really not outdated, but they were actually forward-minding people. And I would just like to take this time to thank and salute your efforts, both Peter at the Hamilton Wenham Rod and Gun Club, to help people responsibly exercise those Second Amendment rights. And I would like to thank you, Mr. Yacino, for coming on this show and really educating the populace as to what is going on through your actions at Goal. And I hope that you are successful in trying to recruit that groundswell of support in the voting electorate to actually take action so that we can have responsible leaders who will take a look at the Second Amendment with respect, and that will protect our Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms, which was the cornerstone of our country. And we thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching this, the Ted Maravillas America First Hour. Of course, any questions about this show, please give me a call or write to the address that's on the screen. I'd be more than happy to talk to you. Or why don't you give Mike Yacino a letter in the mail, and I'm sure he'd be glad to get back to you with some more information. And again, thank you very much, and have a nice night.
Just in case you don't remember, let me jog your memory. In a church they called the Waco Compound back in April '93, 17 little children, all so helpless and so small, died a senseless death of gas and flames. How many names can you recall?